what I got. Plus a tube of grease paint and a follow spot. Could you turn the spot on there, please? Because I'm going to do things up here and it's a bit dark. And I noticed that there was light here before. Anyway, so far, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, fantastic. So I'm Sten Ternström from Stockholm, and I am now going to talk about the third thing that happens. We've talked about respiration, breathing, we've talked about phonation, and now we come to articulation. And if you ask a musician, what? Something has happened to my mic, and I don't think it's my fault.
No, it's
right. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so we have this wonderful tube going from the vocal folds to the lips, which we call the vocal tract. And if you were to tell me to say ah and then cut off my head right above the vocal folds, it would no longer sound like an ah, it would sound more like or something like that. But if we attach some kind of tube to it and change the shape of it, you're getting the general idea. And it turns out that as humans, we are uniquely equipped to modify the shapes of our vocal tract. Most animals can't do that, and that is why you can't really teach a dog or even a chimpanzee to talk. Because they don't have the wiring to control. They have very much the same machine, but they don't have the same degree of control. So why do we have a vocal tract? Well, if we had only phonation, communication would still be possible, but much slower. I mean, you could imagine actually performing the works of Shakespeare in Morse code. But it would be extremely slow. And maybe not as expressive. This is very clever that we have something with many degrees of freedom to do things with. However, we should remember that speech and song are very low in priority for survival. This whole construction is very strange. We have a narrow bottleneck in which everything is supposed to happen. We've got all the nerves to the body, we've got the breathing, we've got swallowing, and so on. And so the first thing we do with this machine we have here is to breathe. The second thing, of course, we do is to eat and drink and so on. And then the third thing in importance would be probably to call for help or scream. And then it's only in fourth priority that we do speaking and singing and so on. And that's easy. If you were to jab me with a pitchfork, I would stop talking and I would start screaming. So that has sort of a higher priority. And we have, over the course of evolution, over unthinkable lengths of time, we have acquired superb control over the shape of our vocal tract. So let's look at some sounds. And in fact, I'm going to do this a bit like that and start hello and hello. And now my voice was quieter, right? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. And what do we have on the left side here, we have what's called an oscillogram. So we have time on the horizontal axis and amplitude on the vertical axis. And this is pretty much reflects the motion of the membrane of the microphone. So it's sort of variations in air pressure. And you can see a lot of weird things going on there. So high pitch means many oscillations per second, and low pitch means few. But that's not the whole thing. We can see that there are some very simple oscillations and some complex ones, like E. So let's have a look at what they contain. Now that's what you probably recognize as a particular kind of wave shape. Anybody have an idea? sine wave, right? And the sine wave is the simplest form of wave shape because it's just a circle that you see sideways. Okay, so it's a projection of the circle. And it has only one frequency, so the number of turns per second. And that's why it's also called a pure tone, so it only has one partial tone or one harmonic. And we can see that so on this other display, we have actually frequency on the horizontal axis and level or decibels on the vertical axis. So as I go soft, and I invite you all to join me in this and see if you can see your whistle on the screen. It's a bit grainy, I can tell. My screen is much prettier, but anyway. And you can also see that if I go do something other than and we get something rather more complicated. Like that. Now every one of these, can you see that there are vertical? It's a bit. Let's do. Stretch it out a bit. And in fact, every one of these peaks represents a sine wave. And not just that, but all these sine waves are in lockstep with each other. So we have one at the basic frequency, and then one at twice the frequency, second harmonic, and the third, 3 times the frequency, and so on. And we also see that some of them are weak, and some others are very strong. And this is very relevant to both vowels and voice identification. Let's have a look at different voice sounds. So you notice that as I change vowel, that contour, the mountain range, changes shape. But if I change pitch, the mountain range stays pretty much put, right? So the identity of the vowel is somehow encoded in the distribution of these frequencies. Great. Another thing we do before we carry on here is to look at unvoiced sounds. So we can do sh, and you see there's still a kind of a mountain range that changes with the timbre of the sound. But a very interesting thing about this is that these sh sounds look as if they dominate the whole frequency range. You see that? Sh, compared to which is sort of over on at the low frequency end. But that's because we're on a linear frequency scale and our ear doesn't do that. So this is how the ear tends to perceive it. So now you see that the high frequency hissing sound is shoved over to one end. And that's because we only have 10 octaves of hearing, and those the sibilant sounds like fricatives of S and F and so on, they tend to be in the top half or in the top even 3/4 of the range. Okay. Enough of that. So we'll say thank you for the music. And then we will look at this in a slightly different way. So we're going to see if we can imitate this. Now, scientists are very fond of building models and simplifying things. So we have this vocal tract, and in the first approximation, we can approximate it with a tube. And for an adult male vocal tract, it's usually about 17, 18 centimeters, and this has consequences for how it sounds. Now you know that pipes have resonances, okay? You hear it, there's a very clear pitch out of that. And in fact, if I can imagine, try to make myself into a cylinder. It's not far from, right? But it's a very simplified model. Now, we said that the humans can change their vocal tract shapes a great deal. So we want a model that can change its vocal tract shape, which I will do by inserting an obstruction, which we will approximate with the tongue. So changing the shape of this tube vastly changes the way that the different harmonics are amplified in that tube by different resonances. So let's see if we can, yeah, I think I will, no I won't, I will stay on track here to be on the safe side. So here's another version of the spectrum display, and here is a little program that you can all download if you like, called Mother. Many of you will have done that already. So what is this? Well, this is a little synthesizer, and we will show now how we can build a vowel sound by adding sine waves together. So this is the sound of a sine wave, like that, and if we look at it, it looks a bit like that. And if we do, let's see, that makes it run a little bit slower, which is good. Okay. And on this display here, I don't know if you can see it, if it's clear enough, but I can actually manipulate these waveforms. So at the top we have the oscillogram of the sine wave, and at the bottom we have a spectrum of the same, where we have only one frequency that is high, but I can add more. And you notice how that waveform becomes more and more like something else, which we call a sawtooth. And I can keep going like this, and then in the end we get a buzzing sound like that, which isn't very nice at all. So let's not listen to it more than we absolutely have to. Now, of course, that is a very simple approximation of this sound. If we were to take the spectrum of that, it would look a bit like, in fact we could probably, if I do that. Well, you see, at least in the beginning, it kind of slopes down, rather like that first one does. But it doesn't sound like it very vocal at all. So that's because we don't have a tube. So let's add a tube. We'll add one resonance, like that. That's a lot more fun, isn't it? And if we do, notice the pitch is the same all the time, but different harmonics are at different amplitudes. Let's go down a bit. And now we can very clearly see that there is a peak here, a resonance with a characteristic peakiness. And with this device we can already make some sort of, let's see, adjustments. So I'm now going to put the frequency of this resonance on the horizontal axis. So we can conclude that first resonance is a bit like opening the mouth. Wow, wow. Intriguing. Now, if we also add a second resonance, we can start moving up and down to get the second resonance in place like that. It's not easy to hear because it's much weaker than the first. So that gets better, but what we need to do now is we need to add even more of these. So there's an R. Sorry, I'm gonna turn it down, don't worry. This is what happens when we have two resonances at the same frequency and they help each other and it becomes very loud. So I mustn't do that. And that's almost a bit too weak, but how are we for time? I need to get moving. Okay. And now, if we explore this space, which the pioneers did many years ago, we find that you can reach very many vowels by combining this. So we have and and e and u. And if we were to go to the middle of if you recall this thing, the maths will tell us that we will get resonances at about 500 and 1500 and 2500 and 3500 and so on hertz. And it goes up in principle to infinity, but then we don't have that much energy at high frequency. So kind of most of the energy is below about 5 kilohertz or so. And then if we're in the hi-fi business, we want to go higher than that. Okay, so let's revisit this a little bit. The sine wave is a simplest periodic waveform, and it's a perfect spiral seen sideways. Now, a very clever Frenchman whose name was Jean-Baptiste Fourier, he said that any periodic waveform, no matter how intricate, can be expressed as the sum of sine waves, using frequencies that are always integer multiples of the fundamental frequency, 100, 200, etc., or 110, 220, 330, and so on. And such a sequence is called a harmonic series. And so you might well wonder, when I say, ah, why don't I hear all these tones all together as a chord? We just hear one tone. That's a bit bizarre. That's because when we look at the waveform, it's periodic, and it means that the brain kind of figures out that, oh yeah, this is something that repeats. And our brain is incredibly good at finding repetitions in sound. Whether it be, if you take just 2 or 3 cycles of something, you can start hearing a pitch. The brain wants to hear a pitch. And if you repeat the same thing 100 times, it's a bit like this, and then if you repeat it over 10 seconds, you very quickly realize that this is not very exciting because nothing is happening if you repeat it mechanically as we did here. But the body is such that we never do anything exactly repeated. And that's one of the secrets of making a natural sounding voice with machines, is to add full variations. The frustrating thing is that you can't add just any variations. You have to add variations that are consistent with our idea of how the body works. And this is very exciting, and we could do another lecture on synthesizing voices more ambitiously than we did here. Anyway, resonance, we've already mentioned a little bit about that. Now, we have a special name for resonances in the vocal tract. We call them formants. So, what is a resonance? Procedure to determine whether or not a given object has a resonance. Hit it. And listen. And if it says bong or ding, then it has a resonance. And if it says bong or pop, pop, it has a little bit of resonance. And if it just goes pop or click, then there's not much resonance. It's simple. Of course, as scientists, we don't really want to express ourselves in that way. So we have a formal procedure to characterize the resonance properties of a given system. Impart, it's the same thing, really. Impart an impulse of energy to the system, record the system's response to this impulse, and then each sinusoidal component of the response, if any, corresponds to a resonance. So don't get fooled by all the jargon. It can be much simpler, as you have just seen. Now, a single pulse is a one-time event, it's not periodic, but when the same pulse is repeated regularly, the waveform becomes periodic. And the fundamental frequency is the number of repetitions per second. And there are various symbols for fundamental frequency in the literature, but the one we favor nowadays is this little italic lowercase f with the subscript O for oscillation. So this is not a zero, because the figure digit 0 makes no sense to the concept of fundamental frequency. But in a lot of old literature you will see a 0 here, but it means the same thing. Okay, so we're summarizing this. We have a source, beautiful source, or we could have a as a source, or we could indeed have as a source. And then that signal gets passed through a filter which has resonances in it. And in fact, this other tube also has resonances, not unlike. But the difference here is that this tube is flexible, which is a slight improvement of the model. And then when the sound passes through those resonances, some of the harmonics are stronger and others are weaker. And so we get an output spectrum which is a vowel sound. So I think if you're a duck or something, this is incredibly exciting. So I hope there are no ducks around. However, if we attach this, then we begin to hear a sort of sound. And of course, many people sound like that. But if we change the shape of it, and if you practice a lot, you can say vague things like, I love you, or something. And nerds do. I have a few minutes left. All right, so let's just make a fun little experiment here. We'll run a sweep recorder. I have here a pair of headphones extra, and I'm going to put a sine wave sweep through these headphones, first without the tube, and then with the tube, and we'll see what happens. And this is a bit tricky. I have to turn my mic off to do it, which I just did. And now we're going to first make a sweep without the tube. It could be quite loud, but I hope the gentleman in the back will help me. formant is an acoustic resonance in the vocal tract. What controls the formant frequencies? So we've said it's the shape of the vocal tract. And the main articulators are, for the first formant, the jaw opening. Wah, wah. Of course, that will also affect the others a bit, but not as much. And for the second formant, it's the tongue position. Like that. And you can easily confirm that for yourselves. And in English, F1 and F2 actually pretty much nail down all the vowels that you need. However, in my language, in Swedish, they don't, because we have about 23 vowels in Swedish, I think. And it's like, we also have O, E, but when you get up to the top around E, we also have I, U, Ö, E, and lots of front vowels. And they rely on the third formant, which is caused by the little cavity in the front of the mouth, like that. So it's wonderful, really. And whereas in Spanish, I think you have only 5 vowels, which makes life a lot easier. Okay, but it doesn't stop there either. We know that we can recognize the different people's voices from the sound of their voice, even with a very short excerpt. And that's due to the higher formants, the 4th and the 5th and the 6th, and so on. And they are very much dependent on the vocal tract length. So if I push up my larynx as high as I can, I sound like a shorter person. And I'm not raising the pitch, or I'm trying not to raise the pitch anyway.
And conversely, if I lower my larynx and still try to speak at the same pitch, I sound like a taller person.
So this is great. And I find it quite fascinating that the body has learned to encode all these properties into a single sound. We can tell so many things about somebody from the voice. Animals cheat. They know that big animals have a lower and larger sound. And so there are lots of instances of small animals that sound like big animals because they want to scare off people with tricks like and things like that. So of what use are the formants? Vowel identity, F1, F2, and in some cases F3. Speaker identity, mostly coded into F3 and to F5. Increased audibility, and this is the bit to do with the singer's formant cluster. Don't have time to demonstrate that, but I'm sure you will come across that in the days to come. And increased amplitude, so female sopranos have to open wide to get the high notes. You can't sing, makes absolutely no sense at all. So, makes a much louder sound because you're tracking the first partial with the resonance, which can make 30 dB of difference to your output and 30 grand difference in your in your takings. So that's very important. We've looked at sound signals in the time and frequency domains. We've looked at the spectrum of a sound and harmonic series, and we've established that formants is a name for resonances in the vocal tract, and they are much to be considered a singer's best friends. And I think I'll leave it there.
So we're going to talk about perception. What is perception? So it's the process of attaining awareness or understanding of sensory information. Of course, sensory systems include taste, touch, smell, vision, and hearing, and we're going to focus on hearing. But many of the principles that apply to hearing also apply to other components of our sensory systems. So the process of attaining an awareness or an understanding of information. And when we're talking about the perception of sound, we really build on what we just learned in the previous tutorial. The physical attributes of the acoustic signal start the process. And so our perception builds upon the physics of sound. The acoustic signal in the case of voice is coming from the larynx, but a lot of the same principles apply to acoustic signals that come from any other sound source. And then we have a sound source somewhere in space. It produces a vibration. That vibration transmits through a medium. The medium is usually air, and then gets to a receiver. And in this case, we're thinking of our ear as the receiver. And the ear, as sound travels through the different components of the ear, it transforms the vibration into many different representations. And we'll talk about how that happens throughout the auditory system. And then that representation gets transformed from a vibration to a neural code, which passes up through a number of different stages of the central auditory system. And it's that central auditory system and the ultimate cortical processing that gives us the attachment of meaning or some psychological attributes to sound. So we'll walk through that process today. Many times when you're in undergraduate or grade school or university, you get a cartoon like this illustrating the three components of the human ear. So you've got the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And we're going to talk about the anatomy, or at least some highlights of the anatomy of these three portions of the ear, as well as some functional aspects, so the physiology or function of those and how they contribute to our perception of sound, which ultimately is going to involve neural processing. So here's a slightly different cartoon of the periphery of the auditory system. So again, the outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear. And in this case, we see a sine wave traveling from some source like this speaker here through the ear canal and to the eardrum. You can see that this structure is surrounded by bone. So that's the stippled area above and below, and it would actually be in all dimensions around the ear canal, the middle ear, and the cochlea. That bone is the temporal bone, which is one of the bones that makes up the skull. And it is one of the things that's going to kick off our award-winning considerations of the human ear. So it represents an award for human, in the category of human anatomy. And first quiz question, what award does the temporal bone win? Close. It is the densest bone in the human body. The temporal bone is the densest bone in the human body. It's the bone that surrounds the ear. In some of us, it's more dense than others. But in everyone, it's your densest bone. We can move on to the middle ear, which is the structure right here. It's bordered by the eardrum. The eardrum is made of 3 layers of skin. And the middle ear consists of a number of different bones as well as muscles and ligaments. And it also has an award for human anatomy. What's the award, quiz question number 2, that the middle ear bones have achieved? Smallest bones in the human body. Very good. So far you've got 1 out of 2 from me. Give you a pass on the first one. All right. And now let's move on to the more peripheral portion here, the pinna. That's the part of the ear that we can see without even looking inside the ear with any kind of special flashlight. And the pinna has a number of different landmarks. These are folds and contours and cavities in the pinna. They're standard across all of our ears. They might be a little different from one person to the next, but we see a helix around the outside. We see a tragus over the opening of the ear canal, another bump that's called the antitragus, a big cavity here called the concha. And these features here have also won an award based on the category of anatomy. Anybody have an idea of what that is? Overlaps with the category of forensics. In human identification, ear prints are more accurate than fingerprints. The problem is it's pretty hard to get an ear print of somebody before they commit the crime. Right? We'll get there one day. All right. In addition to these anatomical features here, they actually contribute a functional role. So we can move towards some of the function of these structures. First of all, the pinna acts as a filter, and it acts as a special kind of filter, not just a resonance like we were seeing in the previous tutorial, but it acts like something called a comb filter or a delay and add filter. So imagine sound is coming from a source, sort of as a plane wave through air. Some of that sound will go directly into the ear canal. Others will get caught up into the crevices and curves of the pinna and then go into the ear canal. So that then part is a delay, and it gets added to the direct sound source, and that delay and add network produces a filter, that introduces a series of valleys and peaks in the spectrum. And those valleys and peaks in the spectrum are the cue for our auditory system to determine the location of a sound source in the vertical plane. So if a sound is coming from below the ears, the peaks are more towards the left, and the peaks and valleys are more towards the left. And as the sound source goes through the plane of the ear and above, you see a shift in the peaks and valleys to higher and higher frequencies. And that's one way we can localize sound source in the vertical plane. All right, so ear canal. Ear canal has a resonance. So it's a tube, very similar to the tubes we just learned about. I'm not going to hit the side of my ear canal, it hurts. But trust me that it's a tube and it has a resonance. You wouldn't hear it if I hit it anywhere. You'd hear one of those other sounds Sten made. So, what does the ear canal do with this resonance? Well, it turns out that the resonance of the ear canal is fairly broad and centered around about 3,000 hertz. And that's a really fortuitous frequency for the resonance to be, because it turns out that if you were to plot the importance of different components of speech as a function of the frequency of the speech, the most important region is right here around 2,000 to 3,000 hertz. So this amplification improves our intelligibility of speech, which is pretty remarkable, but also much needed, because it turns out if you look at intensity as a function of frequency, speech is most intense at low frequencies and gets weaker and weaker and weaker as you go up in high frequencies. So the most important parts of speech are not the highest level parts of speech. So the amplification, again, helps us understand the weaker but most important parts of speech. So the ear canal resonance is really, really helpful. Now, going beyond the outer ear, we can go to the middle ear, and as I mentioned earlier, it's bordered by the eardrum here, which is made up of 3 layers of skin. You can see some of the densest bone in the body surrounding it and protecting it. You see air molecules that are forming a vibration in air, and those transfer into a mechanical vibration of the tympanic membrane or eardrum. And that also results in a vibration of these ossicles that are suspended in the middle ear with ligaments and muscles. And the goal is to create a vibration in the fluid-filled cochlea. The problem that we have is vibration does not like to go from a medium of air to a medium of fluid. There's an impedance or a mismatch between the ability of energy to flow from one medium to the other. And that would be a terrible problem if we didn't have the middle ear, because we would hear sounds much lower in level than we do with the middle ear. So people have analyzed the function of the middle ear and have determined that it amplifies sound about 33 decibels, which is a huge amount of amplification. And it does so by virtue of 3 physical properties, all passive. One is that the eardrum area is much bigger, which is capturing the vibration, much bigger than the delivery of the vibration at the footplate of the stapes. And that difference is called an area ratio. I refer to it as a thumbtack effect because it functions. If you were trying to push a rod into a wall with your thumb, it would probably hurt your thumb and you probably wouldn't get it very far into the wall. But if you put a big surface on the end of it, you can push it right into the wall. That's increasing the pressure at one end relative to the other. And that gives us an amplification of about 25 dB, which is really large. Likewise, these ossicles function as a lever based on the way they're oriented to each other. And the eardrum vibration is not shown well in this cartoon, but it also gives us about another 6 dB of amplification, totaling about 33 dB. and allowing sound energy to travel from air in the ear canal to fluid in the inner ear, which then takes us to the inner ear. And the inner ear is pretty tiny. It's this coiled up snail-shaped structure surrounded by the temporal bone. If you remove the temporal bone, you see the coils here. And to see inside it, you can take a slice, kind of like taking a slice of pie and then looking inside, or a slice of a melon and looking inside. And in fact, if you look longitudinally right into here and blow it up, you see several different very important structures. So these two structures in green are chambers that are continuous with each other and carry fluid. And the footplate of the stapes, when it vibrates this fluid. And that fluid vibration then causes the middle chamber here to also vibrate. But the trick is this middle chamber, linked by bone over here, and a membrane in the middle, is tuned to vibration, very much like a stringed instrument. And so if we'll uncoil this and look at the stringed instrument portion in a moment, but sitting on top of this membrane called the basilar membrane is the main structure of sensation in the auditory system. So this is where all of the conversion of vibration to neural impulses occurs. And we can blow that up a little bit and look at it down here, and you see the pink cells on top of the basilar membrane are supporting structures. The purple or slightly darker ones are called hair cells. They're cell bodies that have little cilia on top. And the cilia on top get stimulated when the basilar membrane goes up and down because of a vibration. Then the membrane across the top shears those hair cells, the little hairs. And when it shears in one direction, the cell bodies bathe the dendrites underneath with a chemical bath that causes the nerve fibers to have an action potential. So we get translation of vibration on the basilar membrane into an action potential that then goes to the auditory nerve. That bundles up and goes to the brain. And so we're converting vibration in air to vibration in the middle ear to vibration in fluid to vibration on the basilar membrane to a neural code. And that neural code mimics the vibration, which is pretty amazing. And that's the sensory organ of the auditory system. All right, so if we uncoil that sensory organ, it looks a little bit like this, and functionally, it's like a stringed instrument, kind of like a harp, or if you imagine the strings in a grand piano, and it's tuned in a very similar way with the same basic physical properties. So for example, near the base, the fibers at the basilar membrane near the base, or where the footplate of the stapes is, are very short. They have a lot of tension, and they have very little mass. So that makes their natural vibration very high in frequency. And as you progress from the base towards the apex, the fibers get longer that stretch across the basilar membrane. They have more mass, and they have less tension. And that causes tuning to go from high frequency to low frequency. So we have a way of coding sound frequency in the basilar membrane in terms of the place of maximum stimulation. And that's the first level of tuning in the auditory system. That's preserved throughout the central auditory system as well. The central auditory system is more complicated, and so we're going to spend less time on it. But the central auditory system gets its input again from the cochlea, and there is a brainstem component, a midbrain component, a thalamus, and a cortex. And starting at the brainstem, we get remarkably good coding of the timing of the acoustic signal. This is a brainstem recording to this stimulus. And look at the remarkable timing preserved in the neural firing. So exquisite timing information, very good frequency information, very good intensity information. And as you go up in the brain, that gets coded and recoded in terms of temporal frequency and intensity cues, patterns of those cues across frequency, patterns of those cues in the right ear versus the left ear. And ultimately, when you get to the thalamus, we start to be able to attend to different components of that coded signal. And at the cortex, we begin to form auditory objects related to different sound sources because of their common patterns, auditory streams, and we can build a neural picture of the auditory scene around us. That's basically how our perception starts. Now, in terms of fundamental perceptual abilities, we have 4 major classes of fundamental perceptual abilities. In the big picture, each class has some subclasses. But what is critical to know is that within the realm of sensory processing, taste, touch, smell, vision, hearing, each one of these domains wins the prize. So we have an award for every one of these fundamental processing abilities by the auditory system. Intensity processing. Now we can process the intensity of light with our eyes, the intensity of touch, or stimulation on our physical body with the sense of touch. But with hearing, our dynamic range for intensity is incredibly large, so large we have to put it on a logarithmic scale, and on a logarithmic scale it's about 110 decibels, from the softest sound you can hear to the loudest sound you can tolerate. 110 decibels is a massive range when you put it on a linear scale. Yet we can detect the just noticeable difference in intensity of less than 1 dB, orders of magnitude more sensitive than any other sensory system that we have. In terms of temporal processing, we got a lot of information about the timing of acoustic signals in the last tutorial. And the auditory system, again, is the record holder among sensory systems for precision in the time domain. Our temporal fine structure coding, which lets us get that cycle by cycle variation of vocal fold movement, lets us code that, is precise enough to not only code that, but to allow us to compare that across frequency. Spectral processing is that comparing of intensity variations across frequency as well as detecting changes in frequency. And again, our ability to detect changes in frequency is very, very precise. So that allows us to detect very small changes in fundamental frequency, those that are intended and sometimes not intended, changes in formant frequency, changes in the frequency of other sounds that are not related to voice. And finally, spatial processing. Our coding of auditory space is incredibly sensitive, largely due to the timing of the auditory system. So we can determine whether a sound is coming from the right, the left, or the center, right, center, left, based on the time of arrival at the sound at the 2 ears. The time of arrival is the time it takes for sound to get from here to here. That difference tells us the direction of a sound, and that difference is on the order of about 10 to 20 millionths of a second, or microsecond, so incredibly precise time. In terms of those fundamental perceptual abilities, they lead to several different perceptual attributes, and the attributes include the perception of loudness, pitch, and quality. And loudness and pitch are fairly straightforward. Quality is something we don't talk about as much, but there are 3 dimensions of sound quality: tonality, roughness, and sharpness. And they come with a ton of different descriptors, but we can focus on those 3 different attributes of quality as well as pitch and loudness and get a little bit better sense of sensory perception. And so in terms of loudness, it's the perception of sound intensity. So sound intensity is the physical stimulus, loudness is the psychological correlate. And it has a very arcane definition in the ANSI standards, but it's basically a scale that extends from quiet to loud, where quiet is low intensity and loud is high intensity. And this is some data collected back in the 30s. And this is a ridiculously large amount of human data because there are many individual points at different frequencies averaged across a lot of listeners. But what it ends up forming is something called an equal loudness contour. The very bottom curve is our detection threshold as a function of frequency. So that would map onto an audiometric normal hearing, or 0 dBHL. And you can see that we're most sensitive around 3,000 hertz, that magical resonance of the ear canal. And our sensitivity gets worse as you go lower in frequency and worse as you go higher in frequency. This is the threshold curve, but any curve above this is called an equal loudness curve. Every point on this second curve is equal in loudness to every other point on that second curve. Likewise, every point on this top curve is equal in loudness to every other point on this curve. And we can start to dive in a little bit by just looking at two different frequencies, 100 hertz and 1,000 hertz. And we'll look at the first very low level, which is 10 dB SPL at 1,000 hertz. That is equal in loudness to every other point on this curve, including at 100 hertz, a sound that's 46 dB SPL. So a 10 dB SPL at one frequency equal to a 46 dB SPL sound at another frequency. That contour has a lot of shape to it. Our loudness varies a lot with sound frequency when we're at low levels. If we go up to say 80 dB SPL, that's a very flat curve. So the loudness perceived at 1,000 hertz is only 2 dB different from the loudness perceived at 100 hertz. This is relevant for things like sound reproduction. Suppose we're recording a live musical concert. The concert, say, averages its level around 80 dB. So what we would be hearing if we were attending that live concert is a fairly flat frequency response. If you now were to record that and then present it at a later time at a much lower level, our sound perception of loudness is very different now across frequency at that lower level. So to get the rich sound quality of our original recording, we would need to use a sound equalizer and boost the low frequencies and high frequencies to give us the timbre that we got from the original recording. In terms of pitch, there are three main components of pitch. Pitch height, which is the attribute of sound in terms of which sensation may be ordered on a scale of low to high. So pitch height is going from low to high, and I don't whistle as well as our previous speaker. I don't sing as well either. Pitch chroma, the notes on a musical scale that repeat every octave. And pitch strength, the salience of the pitch. So for example, if we had two different pitch heights and they were very punctate in frequency, like a tone, you would hear low, high. But if it were a noise stimulus, you would hear shh, low, high. Both have a pitch change in pitch height, but the strength of the second pitch, the noise, is much weaker. I'll skip the trivia for a moment. It had to do with the invention of the internet, which is not that relevant. You can ask me after. Sound quality. So sound quality has three basic components: tonality, roughness, and sharpness. Tonality is the balance between periodicity or harmonicity and noise or aperiodicity. Roughness is rapid and repeated fluctuations in amplitude and frequency, and sharpness has to do with spectral edges. So those are three basic components that lead to very dramatic changes in sound quality. If we think about voice quality for a little bit, three basic components of voice quality are breathiness, roughness, and strain. And one way to think of those is to put them in this same categorization, where breathiness, a relationship between harmonicity and noisiness, is analogous to tonality in sound quality. Roughness, remarkably, is analogous to roughness in sound quality. And sharpness, or changes in spectral edges, is related to the perception of vocal effort or strain. So that gives us some unifying way of considering sound quality and voice quality. And when we think about measuring voice quality, we are going back to psychophysics. The physics part is the acoustic signal. The psycho part is measuring the psychological perception. And we have a few different tasks that we could use and a couple of different measurement methods. The measurement methods we use most often are rating scales, magnitude estimation, and matching. And we can use these to measure breathiness, roughness, and strain of voices. But they differ in terms of the quality of the data that they return, and they differ in terms of the feasibility in clinical versus laboratory settings. So for example, rating scales are used widely in clinical settings. They have a huge benefit of being very rapid. They're very short tasks, so they can be administered very quickly. They don't require recording of a stimulus. You can do it on live voice. The instructions are not very complicated, and a single rater can give you data. The downsides, though, are that the results that you get may depend heavily on instruction, training, or experience. They may be biased in terms of the set of sounds that they are presented with, or the set that are in the mind of the person who's doing the rating. And they may be biased in terms of the magnitude of those particular the set of sounds that are in someone's mind. And there's several other biases that make rating scales a little less reliable than some of the other methods that we have. And there have been some efforts to improve rating scales. One is in terms of averaging multiple ratings, but clinically that's not very viable. Another is providing external standards or anchors, and that's very realistic clinically if you're rating recordings, but not if you're monitoring live voice for your ratings. And providing listener training modules, which is extremely helpful in any aspect of auditory perception. Also, acoustic measures are very popular as measures of voice quality. A downside of acoustic measures is that there are many, many of them, and you have to decide which ones to choose from. Another downside is that they often correlate poorly with perceptual judgments, which limits their utility. Here you see some data from a number of different publications that show correlations between an acoustic measure and perception within the same study. And you see a lot of these correlations are pretty low, with one exception, and that's the cepstral measures, which tend to correlate very well with perception of the severity of dysphonia. So, we also have combined acoustic measures, and these are usually combinations of multiple measures that already have a pretty good correlation with perception. So things like the cepstral spectral index of dysphonia or the AVQI are quite helpful. They're strongly correlated with overall severity of dysphonia, but they lack the ability to differentiate between breathiness, roughness, and strain. So another approach that has been used is to combine a lot of what we've learned from psychoacoustics with what we know about the perception of voice. Use those principles of sound quality, some of the laboratory methods that we use in psychoacoustics to give us the best possible data that we can get in the laboratory, and then create computational models. But have the computational models respect all of the transformations of the acoustic signal that happen as you go through the auditory system and through the auditory brain. So these are bio-inspired computational models. The idea there is to then create some clinical methods that will allow us to do rapid, simple measurement in the clinic, but that reflect some of the same qualities that we get from our laboratory methods. And the ultimate goal is to develop some scales for the sound or voice qualities of breathiness, roughness, and strain that would be useful in a clinical setting. And that will take a construction or a layering of basic physical principles, psychoacoustic principles, extracting data from the laboratory methods and the computational methods, and then creating a simplified version of measurement based on a combination of the methods of magnitude estimation matching with anchor sounds. And so with that, I will close by saying thank you, and we'll take questions during the panel discussion.
Hi, happy 6 o'clock. I did this last year, and I can't believe they asked me to do it again. So it's nice to be back, an honor to be back, and once again I will say, ridiculously intimidating to follow all those awesome talks, but very enlightening, and now I'm obsessed with my ears. I'm thinking of, I heard that. Okay, all right. So now we're going to talk about voice performance pedagogy, give an overview of that. So really, voice performance pedagogy, what does it involve? A lot of things, right? Let's end there and get dinner. There's a lot of things. We're going to talk about all of them, but first, I have an obsession of late, which involves it's an aspect of learning, right? And I feel like uncertainty has, over the last couple of decades, become this thing that's associated with worry, and it's a bad thing. Let's not let you be uncertain. Let's make you be sure, always, so you feel warm and cozy. And there's a problem with that. We've demonized, I'm going to use a cartoon, we demonized uncertainty, right? So it became this thing that's coming to get you, right? Anybody afraid? They're laughing at this thing. So what does science say about uncertainty, right? Well, uncertainty leads to motivation to learn, right? So it's actually quite important. It leads to curiosity and then open mind. It leads to improved memory and understanding. It leads to development of cognitive skills. And these studies actually showed when they just gave an idea, you need to do this, and didn't give any guidelines to children, they came up with like dozens of new things to how to approach the problem. It leads to creativity and innovation and a growth mindset. So think about it as this uncertainty leads to curiosity, which then leads to an open mind, which takes in new information, which then leads to deeper understanding and the growth mindset. Also, it helps us with preparation for the unknown, which leads me to voice. We are all engaged in a wonderful aspect of being human and having a voice and using it in speech and singing and communication, but there's so many things, as we all know as researchers, that are still unknown. And I think most of us in this room are super curious about that and excited about that, but I do see new generations getting intimidated by that and being overloaded by that. So I think we should take this idea of the demonized thing and have it go away, and let's keep with the cartoon, and we should learn that uncertainty is our friend. And we should go that extra step and learn to embrace uncertainty. There we go. I was working on this and my 15-year-old came up and he said, "What are you doing, Dad?" And I said, "I'm working on a talk for the Voice Foundation." He said, "You're going to show that?" So, he'll be very proud of his father. Or not, I don't know. Okay, anyway, so we'll get on to the real talk. But I do think that that's an issue, and I've noticed it in my children's learning and inability to be okay in that space. So I think we collectively as educators should be talking about this regularly and helping our students embrace uncertainty. I give a little bit of that talk in my vocal pedagogy classes every time, just so people are not thinking it's not okay to not know something. It's an interesting time we're living in. So, definition of pedagogy, it is the art, science, and profession of teaching. So, definition of voice performance pedagogy, same thing, just add voice performance. Not so hard. Art of singing, which is what we're going to get into, the nuanced and intentional use of the singing voice to communicate an idea, feeling, emotion, or concept, often conveying aspects of the human condition or what it means to be alive. I think that's what we're doing. We're engaging in something that is bonding and global. It's really lovely. Science of singing, what does this provide? I think we've heard enough about that because we see that there's so much that we do know. There's so much we don't, but there's so much we do know, and there's some scientific groundings for all the things we're doing. It provides this theoretical underpinning to guide us in our approach to singing. It requires further study in anatomy, physiology, and acoustics of the voice, and also further study in learning theory, motor control, motor learning, and mental emotional aspects of voice use. Lots to learn. So what does it mean to be a teacher of singing? What kind of aspects do you need to develop? Well, first, I'm going to give a shout out to my main voice singing mentor, Barbara Doscher. You have to have a deep knowledge of and passion for the topic. Kind of obsessed with voice and singing. That's all I do. I live and breathe singing. Because you're going to live with it in great moments and horrible moments and all those things. So if you love it, you'll stick with it. But if you don't, then I think you might tire of it. And then your tiring of it may start to reflect in how your students are feeling when you're teaching them. So we have to be mindful of that. Thanks, Barbara, for teaching that. We have to be patient because this is a long haul. This is a journey we're going to be on with our clients for a very long time. We have to have empathy and compassion. What a cute picture. So this is one of the most important things that I don't see always employed. I think realizing that we're dealing with someone who is sharing something very personal with us and hoping for our help as the teacher, and so we need to make sure that we stay empathetic and compassionate in that realm. Also, we need to have diagnostic skills. So it is most helpful if they're based on physiology and acoustics. So having that firm foundation, it really speeds up your game. But I do want to give a shout out to people who develop their ears and ability to hear evenness of timbre or intentional unevenness of timbre. That is a diagnostic skill, and that works very well. But you can speed up your skill set a lot with some of the information we have now in acoustics, especially, and flow dynamics. Discernment. I don't want to skip over this one. I think that's another thing that's being confused with judgment. Judgment is different. Judgment has an opinion about the thing. Discernment is separating out different things. So if you're discerning for your student, you're helping them understand what sounds they can make that are sustainable versus what sounds they can make that you might like but are not sustainable. So that's a key component to what we engage in teaching of singing. A sense of humor. Come on. Teaching voice is hilarious, right? And learning how to sing is hilarious, I think. As long as you create a playful environment, I mean, it really is kind of fun. The sounds you come upon is also intensely moving too, but I think you gotta have that sense of humor. Motivational skills. We are trying to get somebody to do something that is a tertiary use of our sphincteric safety valve. Right? We got to be careful that we don't forget that. This is a very distant thing and an elegant and a refined thing, the way we're using our voice. We need to have flexibility and adaptability, which is also intertwined with learning. And all of that then leads to resilience. And I think that that's what we're striving for. We need resilience, particularly in voice, I would say. I play piano and I play bass. And I don't care so much when people comment on my bass playing, but if somebody comments on my singing, I feel like it's a personal attack on me. So it's definitely different. And a lot of my co-musicians who are also singers, singing musicians, feel the same way. It's deeply personal. So practice kindness. That makes sense to follow that, right? We can all be kinder to each other, I think. And then mindfulness. Mindfulness is a practice of being aware of what you're doing while you're doing it and why you're doing it. And you practice discernment within that realm, not judgment. Lovely. So performance pedagogy. So what are we doing when we're helping navigate the ups and downs of life as a performer? Right, we are going to use these different techniques. We're going to develop a technique that serves communication in the desired genre that the person is singing in. And we're going to help them understand that knowing that this technique is going to be the vehicle upon which all their emotions and ideas will ride. So separating them out has been a big thing in the performing arts for as long as I've been involved in it, and way before me, that people will say, just let go of your technique and just let your voice fly. I'm like, well, if they're holding on to something that's not letting their voice fly, then they need to develop their technique. So the technique is the thing that's going to help you be a nuanced communicator. And I always give a shout out to my buddy, Kenny Werner, who wrote Effortless Mastery, who talks about this. What do you want to do? He's one of the best jazz pianists in the world, and he communicates on a nuanced level. And he was asked, what would you want more of if you could have it? And he said, more technique. That's it. It's a facility for what we're doing. We need to help our artists pivot through sickness, aging, psychological challenges, emotional struggles. So of course, when you get into those areas, you're going to have to outsource some of those things to the rest of the artist team. But you have to be very compassionate and very empathetic when you encounter things like this. We're going to assist translating information received from coaches, conductors, directors, agents, audio engineers. How many of you singing teachers know what I mean when I say that? Yeah, right. So we know we don't know everything, right? But we do know more than some. And so being discerning there too is really helpful to say, what is the language someone else used in the studio, in the opera house, right, on the sound stage, whatever. What is the language they used? And then we need to help translate that language into the changes that the singer needs to make. So that instead of, don't judge it too much, but know that we have to translate. That would be the word I would use. We need to help an artist understand their voice. What are their superpowers? What sets them apart from other people? And then what are their limitations? And then we help guide them into a place where they're using their superpowers more often than they're using their limitations. Balancing the never-ending quest for higher level of artistry with also being okay where you are right now. I think that that's the toughest thing. I've seen more often that people are focused on the be okay where you are. And then the person's losing that push to strive for something better. And I think that that takes away from kind of the biggest drive of being an artist. Can I do it better next time? And I think it was Beverly Sills who said, you're going to sing probably 5 times the way you really want to in your career. Isn't that amazing? Right? That's kind of the reality of it. I think it gives you something to strive for. It gives you something to really strive for and see if you can keep doing better. Being part of a voice team, so you have to play well with others. You have to be okay communicating with a laryngologist, speech-language pathologist, a voice coach, voice builder, therapist, and build the team and see who needs to take care of what aspect of the performer that you're working with. So it's important to be well-versed. And so knowing some of this information that's being talked about today will help you play well with others. It'll help you understand what someone's talking about if they just got back from a laryngologist and said, this is what they said. You can say, okay, I know what that is, and they'll share the information with you, and then that helps build the voice team, which then makes the performer feel much more comfortable. Right? They've got a group of people who are helping them out, not just one at a time. So let's then get into the nuts and bolts of voice building. So you could check out, for a little more detail on this, you could check out my article with Christian Herbst. We wrote this voice pedagogy, what do we need? And it divides the needs for a voice builder versus a coach versus a rehabilitator. So you can check that out and let me know what you think. Let us know what you think. First and foremost, practice empathy and compassion, as I said, right? We're dealing with a human being. The body is the instrument. Very personal then, super personal. Feelings and emotions and trauma can affect that instrument because the signal for voice goes through the emotional center of the brain. Also, emotions and trauma and stress, all of those things can affect proprioception. So the stimuli that arise in the body, people will sense those differently when they're going through different things in their life. So it feels like they have a different voice. They'll come to you and say, I feel like I have a completely different voice. And you're like, you don't, but you've gone through this experience, and so you're probably going to have to learn how to feel it differently for the time being. So you learn to pivot and help them understand that that is the reality that everybody experiences pretty much. We need to, when we're working with people, to listen to their vocal history. So a lot of people have great vocal histories where they sang in church for their whole life, and everybody loved them, and they did all the solos, and now they're singing on stages all around the world. And other people were told to not sing in their elementary school choir, right? And so this all leads to a voice identity. And this person's voice identity, most people are very attached to how they perceive their voice and how they think others perceive their voice. And so we need to, if it's healthy, build on it and keep going with their self-awareness. If it's unhealthy, we need to tread very carefully because a lot of those things might be very negative, have had negative impacts on the person's life. And it ties into their voice and the way they use it and reasons why they use it that way. We need to aim for sustainability. That is a key thing. No one wants to stop singing. There's not a point in life where you're like, I'm done. Don't feel like it anymore. I've not met anyone like that. So artists want to keep singing until they're no longer existing. And so that's an important thing that we have to keep in mind. So we need to emphasize function over aesthetic, with the caveat that we don't want to ignore aesthetic expectations of a genre. So we can take care of a voice and we can also take care of the genre at the same time. We just have to do it mindfully. We need to promote healthy, sustainable, and effective voice production with the least amount of effort. That's a key component. We need to focus in on effort and have an honest conversation with the person making the sounds as to degrees of, on any scale you want, 1 to 10, how difficult is that? Because we know if it's easy, you can do it over and over again. If it's medium hard, you can do it for a certain length of time. If it's really hard, you're not going to do that for a very long time. So assessing that is key in our training. We need to, as trainers for vocal performance, keep an open mind. This is another thing I noticed. Nowadays, you're going to engage in a bunch of different genres for the most part. I have people graduating from Indiana University, which is one of the top classical voice training schools in our country, and they go out and the first job they get, they have to teach music theater as well, right? Or there's a pop component, right? It's the reality of us. So I suggest that we all, while we're awakening this unique timbre, that we not insist on our aesthetic preferences, but we help develop an appreciation of different sound qualities and genres. I love them all. I got lucky. I started in heavy metal and went on from there when the hair went away. It's tragic, y'all. It's tragic. None of my old friends know me. They're like, who's that dude? Anyway, that's true, actually. Approach to teaching. What are we listening and watching for? What are we listening and watching for? Well, balance and ease of production, because that's what's going to lead to sustainability, right? A balanced, easy production, they're going to be able to do it for a long period of time. We also need to watch how each system is functioning separately. Breathing, phonation, like with the shoe thing, right? Breathing by itself, sure, phonation, resonance, articulation, mindset, but then we also have to see how those things are functioning together. For the ultimate training, it's how they're functioning together that's the most complicated thing. But checking in and making sure somebody's aware of expansion, that's important. Spending an entire hour just on that, probably excessive. Right, so I'm kind of thinking, what do we need to do? Check in on things and then get them to be united. So now, we need to add some color, as I said last time. I am colorblind, so this is for all of you. Sorry, this is for all of you who enjoy color. I know there's a yellow there. All right. So also a discussion of the systems involved here. So that's nice. What a nice color. So important facts about breathing, things that we should probably all take into our interactions with our clients. There is no one way to breathe. It doesn't exist. There have been some great studies done now that there's tremendous inter and intra-subject variability in breathing. So there's no one size fits all. So suggesting that everyone does the same thing, not a good idea. You're probably going to miss some people in that process. A combination of thoracic and diaphragmatic breathing is most efficient for voice. That kind of makes sense, big ballpark. If you expand the thorax, that's where the lungs are, and if you also expand the abdomen, then you get the diaphragm to go down, which further expands the lungs. You're using air, this is a wind instrument, good, home run. So it makes sense, but it's a vague, kind of big ballpark thing. Expansion of the epigastrium, that's an outside thing that will let us know that the diaphragm can descend. So that's pretty cool. There's an outside visual of that happening. Deeper breathing, as we heard from Johan, leads to tracheal pull, which leads to a slight abduction of the vocal folds, which leads to flow phonation, right? So if somebody has pressed voice, if you have them take a deep breath, it's going to help them not press, which is kind of opposite of a lot of more popular thoughts in voice training. Don't overfill the lungs, you're going to press your voice. Oops. And I think that's a misunderstanding of how breathing interacts with phonation. However, shallow breathing, no tracheal pull, and the vocal folds adduct more. So you would use that with somebody who has a habitual breathy voice and doesn't want it. I kind of like a breathy voice sometimes, right? It's not a bad thing. So we don't want to demonize breathy voice either. But if somebody has a breathy voice and they don't intend to have a breathy voice, you have to figure out how to do it. So if you go, and then have them talk, they're going to adduct more because they don't have much air to do it. So it's an instinct of the body to adduct. Yeah. So next, important facts about the larynx we should all probably think about a little bit. Higher flow is advantageous for vocal fold function. This is found by both Johan Sundberg and Ingo Tietze and many others. But those guys are two of the first folks who really, really heavily influenced me in this area. So it's advantageous for vocal fold function. It has a slight adduction, which is going to avoid excess collision forces, which was the way that Ingo was studying it, and tied it in with flow phonation. Friction is the enemy of the vocal folds. Excess friction is what wears the tissue down. So anything we can do to reduce that and still deliver what we need to deliver, we should be doing. Getting the appropriate output for a given genre with the least amount of vocal fold friction should be the gold standard for voice training. Practice just enough. What do you need to do to get it? You can't underdo it, because then the aesthetic won't be there, but if you overdo it, you're costing the vocal at the vocal fold level. One way we can do this is train people by squaring up the vocal folds, which will get them a lower phonation threshold pressure and increase efficiency of the vibration. How can you do that? Everybody. Which exercises? Semi-occluded vocal tract exercises, well studied in this area. So that is one way, although you do have to do them properly, or I won't have as good an effect. So that is one way to do it. Important facts about voice acoustics. Well-tuned resonators help facilitate the effective, efficient vocal fold vibration. You can get more warmth in the sound by boosting the fundamental by using more flow. Thanks, Johan. That came out a few years ago, but we've known it for a lot longer than that. So if someone's telling a performer, hey, I need you to warm up that sound, use more airflow. If you use more airflow, then you get a little more low end information instead of the buzzy high end, and you get the warm sound that they want. You could also do it by swallowing the shoulder, but that makes it unclear and probably not the best gesture. Small velopharyngeal opening. That's the space between the soft palate and the back pharyngeal wall. A small velopharyngeal opening is not linked with nasality and boosts higher harmonics without loss of the lower harmonic boost. The study I did with Johan. And then no velopharyngeal opening boosts lower partials with less boost of higher partials, and lots of velopharyngeal opening boosts higher partials with less boost in lower partials. So you can see how the spectrum gyrates when you're changing the amount of opening in the velopharyngeal area. So I think that's a good thing to know if you're trying to get different sound qualities. That's one way to change timbre and change emphasis of harmonic boost. Then how about mindset? I mentioned mindfulness earlier. How does this affect the training of vocal performance? Right. Well, mindfulness will give us significantly better working memory capacity. That sounds good. I like that. And it will also make us better able to sustain attention during a performance task. That's a big part of everything in life, but definitely the training of a physiological coordination. You have to pay attention. And so mindfulness can help you increase that, which is great. It also helps develop the skill of self-observation. So from a neurological standpoint, that helps disengage the autonomic pathways, the automatic pathways that were created by prior learning. So habits that you've established earlier will go away more easily if you practice mindfulness. And then it also enables present moment input to be integrated in a new way. So very positive turnout with mindfulness. How many of you are mindfulness practitioners? I see, okay, a bunch. Yeah, good. Yeah, it's very helpful, yeah? I think it's one of the best things. I'm here right now probably because of mindfulness. I was on a path to self-destruction without it. Very true. Increases information processing speed. Gosh, we could all use that. And the older I get, I really could use that. I feel it. And it decreases task effort and having thoughts that are unrelated to the... Wait, hang on a second. Who was... sorry, it's my brother. Hang on, I'm just kidding. You get the idea, right? Everybody has their watch on and their vibrating phone in their pocket, and we're all distracted. And mindfulness will help you weed out all those distractions, right? So I'm aware of who's asleep right now and who's awake, but because I'm mindful, it doesn't bother me, right? I'm happy that some are listening. No, I'm just kidding. But you're aware of what's going on, and I think that's cool. Next, mindfulness helps us focus on what we're doing while we're doing it and encourages observation over judgment. Miracle of mindfulness, that's where that comes from, and I think that's an important life concept, but very important in the voice studio. So with all that in mind, what are we aiming for? We are aiming for flow phonation, highest possible flow of complete glottal closure. I added insufficient. Now I hope no one's angry with that, but I'll stick with it. And then also effective use of resonance, also known as resonant voice, a voice that's easy to produce and vibrant in the facial tissue, as opposed to in the back of the neck, probably, right? And then present, positive, and proactive mindset. Right? All of those are mindfulness related. So some things I've learned along the way in training. One thing, meet the individual wherever they are, technically, mentally, emotionally. And that's going to change every time they walk into your studio or come online with you. I'm amazed at how it changes, and you've got to be ready to meet that. If they're not the same person or can't do the same things all of a sudden or can do 10 times more, you need to be able to pivot with that and go with it. Always keep an ongoing dialogue. Ask things like, how does it feel? That helps awaken a person's proprioception, which is going to be their guiding force in this business. Their descriptions, not yours, are the most important. I think that that's the most important thing too. We always have ideas of what it might feel like, but you have to check those at the door to some extent. I have people talking about picture frames, you know, and waveforms and colors and all. Great. That's what they sense. Let them sense it. Let them sense it. With the caveat that if they think that, the thing you want to come out has to come out. If they think it and it doesn't, then you have to look for something else. It doesn't mean that that wasn't what they felt, but it means they felt something that didn't help them reproduce the thing they want to reproduce. So you have to then go dive in for another thing. Say, okay, that wasn't the same thing, so what else do you feel? So keep that dialogue going. Ask their impressions of the sounds while they're making them. Any fears, emotional reactions? Do they not like the sound? Do they love the sound? Are they aware of the fact that they only hear 1/3 of their own sound as it's being emitted? Right? So check in with those things. Use contrast and comparison. Negative practice. I know some people now are not using the word negative. That's okay, but I still think it's fine. So negative practice, like this is in the front and this is in the back, this is not swallowed, this is swallowed, and use that. It gives a person this dichotomy to work from. I think that's a great approach. Watch for self-correction and name it quickly. So it means do a task, don't comment, and then do it again, and something may change. And if it changes, say, that one, I really like that. What was that? Well, I feel like I adjusted, I used more air, I took a deeper breath. That's golden in the realm of voice training. That really lands with the person, and they feel very involved in the process then. So I think using things like that are very much student-centered learning. Not handing over the reins as if they can teach themselves, because they can't. They're there for you to teach them, but you can also include them in this guided practice. So, always compare backwards. The idea that we're always looking for this goal that we have in the distance is very bad for the psyche. You're always thinking about, what can I not do still? What can I not? So if you compare backwards, you're thinking about, what could I not do 6 months ago? And now I can do it. It really sets the mind up to feel like I succeeded, and now I have energy to march on and do more. So if we always are looking for the end goal, we're going to be disappointed. Some more things, repetition, 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 right? That helps us solidify neural pathways, right? We're trying to develop coordination, so you got to do it over and over again till it becomes automatic, right? Positive reinforcement in singing during or after the task. In the literature, it says, wait till after. Just let it go. And I don't know if any of you voice teachers have tried that, but you get somebody in there, a new client, and you're going, and they're going, what? What did I do? They're waiting for a reaction. So sometimes people need an initial cheerleader. Yeah, you're doing great. You're doing great. Yeah, that was good, good. Until they feel comfortable enough to then pause a little bit, take in the information, and you can explain, I want to see what it feels like for you. So let's just sing through it and then sit, and then what do you feel? That's fine. But if you lead with that, you're probably going to lose a lot of clients. So I think doing it during as well is very important. Success leads to improved learning, so we need to celebrate all the small victories along the way, which means we need to learn to identify transitional sounds and name them as correct in that moment. All right, so that's hard to do because we know that ultimately they're going to get better and they're going to be better. But if the person goes here and then takes a step to here, we've got to say, yes, that's what I'm looking for. Name it as correct. They feel like they succeeded. They stay in the learning process. And this sums up what I was saying. Don't hold the end goal in mind. End gaining is what F.M. Alexander called it, and that's basically not aiming for the next step in the process, but the final goal. So, thank you, Alexander. A few more things. Provide greater specificity with exercises and training tools and voice training. How you do the exercise matters tremendously. I see people all over the net doing straws and bubble phonation and all these things, and they're not paying attention to how they're articulating it. Just do a big ballpark thing, which may have slight positive effects, but you can get major positive effects if you pay attention. Provide remedies for vocal imbalances before naming them. So when you're working with somebody, I think it's great to give a solution, get them to the other side, then name it. If you hear something and say, ooh, you're pressing, and then you have to then engage in how to fix it, the person's already thinking, the gauntlet has been dropped, I've done something wrong, now I have to do something to fix it. God, I hope this works, or I'm going to look bad. So if you give them the fix first, and then compare backwards, it's an easier learning environment. Develop flow, resonance, and overall proprioceptive awareness using light mechanism first. It's an arena of lower friction, and you can learn all the basics of voice in that arena of lower friction, and then start to add more contact time. So a little shout out to light mechanism, which the sound doesn't work. Great, there was a great sound file with that. Did I do it? No, it's all the way up. Do I have any sound? No, okay, never mind. So learning requires mindfulness over time. That's really the main thing. You have to be aware and you have to spend time doing these things. And over time, you'll notice great differences as you compare backwards. So how to learn the foundational information is the last question we have. And reading is a good place to start. But there's a lot of misinformation in some of the things in print and outdated information. So we have to be discerning in that arena as well. Also watching TikTok and YouTube. There's some great stuff on there, like, I mean, amazing stuff, y'all know. But there's also some unbelievably tragic things on there and suggestions that really will bring harm to a lot of budding singers. So we have to be careful with that. So a better way might be to find really great teachers and observe and pick their brains. I think that's a wonderful way. That's how I learned a lot of chops. Looking up to people who were very, very good teachers and sitting with them. Also, make friends and hang out with voice scientists. I think that's a great idea. And there are a bunch here at a conference like this, and some of them are pretty darn tall. Back there. So they're very easy to spot. Also, meet and befriend a laryngologist. You'll find them out on the golf courses with the other doctors. Just kidding, y'all. Just kidding. No, but you'll find them actually very, very hard at work in their voice center. And again, the information they bring to the voice team is invaluable, obviously. And so getting to know them and speaking the language and helping even them be a translator for the singers that come in, that can be a really great asset as a voice team. And then also, don't forget speech language pathologists. But they are everywhere. You can't miss them. Tons of them. How many are here? I mean, my God, right? We're surrounded. They're awesome people, though, so don't worry. But they're in schools, right? In voice centers, in hospitals, they're everywhere. And so communing with them, too, they have this knowledge base that's so vast. And so the more we can hang out with other people who love voice, and voice modeling and all these things, we start to get to what I think we're all hoping, is we start to get to a much deeper understanding of voice every time we engage. And I think the broader our engagement, the deeper awareness we're going to have. So thank you very much for your attention, and go with the flow.